Okay, this is part 3 of the high school questions and answers. It's actually questions that were submitted, like the first 2 parts, by boys in high school, in the Jewish high school. Those were done in front of a live audience, in front of the actual students. This part is not going to be. This is just going to be recorded without them. I'm going to do 5 questions that they asked about Chumros. And time permitting, we'll continue to other ones. If not, we'll just do that. And the first question was, how come there are some people who eat only Yoshon? Everybody else seems to eat things that are not Yoshon or don't care about them. Why do some people only eat what's Yoshon? And the answer for that takes a couple of minutes, and that is, the Torah tells us that the 5 primary grains, that's wheat, rye, spelt, oats, and barley, you can only eat them if they've been in existence or they were planted by the time a certain carbon is born. The carbon of Eimer is brought on the first day, of Chol Pesach. So that means is that if we planted grains before Pesach, if we planted grains after Pesach, those grains are chadash. So right now, I'm recording this in the summer. If someone would plant grains now, those grains, when they would be harvested, they would be not allowed to be eaten until Chol Pesach in the coming year. Once they pass Chol Pesach, then they're Yoshon, they're old. Until then, they're called chadash, they're new. And after that, they're considered Yoshon, they're old, and you can eat them. So that means if someone planted wheat a year ago, or they planted wheat in the winter, this year in the winter, it would be mutter once they pass through Pesach. Now, most of the poskim say that this halacha applies even if you live out of Eretz Yisrael, even if it grew in the field of a non-Jew. Basically, most poskim say that a person needs to be careful and only eat food that's Yoshon. Now, but on the other hand, for hundreds of years, very fine Yidden, most Jews were not very particular about this din. And so the later poskim talk about different ideas. What was the reason? Why was everybody not being makbid on this, which the earlier poskim seem to be very clear that you have to be makbid on it? And so that's a question that's not for today's discussion, but in fact, so the people who continue to be lenient are following precedent that, in fact, their grandparents and back hundreds of years, people were doing that. And those who are being machmir are saying, listen, the simple din is, the din seems to be pretty clear. It says in the Shulchan Aruch, it says in all the poskim back and forth that a person should be makbid, and that's why they're being makbid. So that's why some people do and some people don't. Now, in the practice of it, in the United States, rye and spelt are always Yoshon, and that's because they're planted in the fall and they're harvested after Pesach. So every time rye and spelt come to market, they are stuff was in existence over Pesach, so we're good through Chol Pesach. And the same thing is also when you make something called winter wheat, which is wheat that's planted Sukkot's time. It then goes dormant during the winter and is harvested in the early summer. So that again always was it had started to grow already before Pesach, and that's always Yoshon. They use that to make like crackers and other crunchy foods. But the concern for people who eat Yoshon is spring wheat and durum wheat. Those are wheats that are used to making bread. That's the spring wheat and other fluffy type foods. And durum wheat is used for making pasta. So those will become chadash. The chadash ones will be harvested sometime in late summer, like right around this time of the year. Now we're in August at this point, so at some point around this time of the year, and those items will be then chadash until Pesach, unless you get ones from the previous year, grains that were held over from the previous year. And the same idea also for oats and barley. They also get harvested around this time of the summer, and then they would be chadash until the next Pesach. So during that time, you have to find things that are that use ingredients that are made from Yoshon, that are held over barley or oats or wheat from previous years. And that brings us right to the next question, and that is, someone tells me, a private person or a company tells me that something is Yoshon. I want to only eat Yoshon, and my neighbor tells me, yeah, this thing is Yoshon. Well, the company says, yes, our products are all Yoshon. Can I take their word for it? Is that good enough? Can I just count on them when they said that? So the general rule is that if a person is Shomer Shabbos, we trust that person on Kashrus and other types of issues, even if that person himself is not particular about that din. Like in this case, many Jews are not particular to only eat Yoshon. So this person is still Shomer Shabbos. He's still a fine, reputable person, even though he does not eat Yoshon. And if he tells me that it is, so the din says is that I'm allowed to trust that person. So as long as I have somebody who's a Shomer Shabbos, he keeps kosher, I can trust that person when that person is trustworthy when he says food is Yoshon, even if he personally does not only eat Yoshon. However, there's going to be a but to this. That means is we know that a person, since he's a Shomer Shabbos, he cares about people following the din, doing the right thing. So when he tells me he's Yoshon, I can trust him that he's telling me the truth. However, he might be telling me the truth, but you have to make sure that the person also is knowledgeable. For example, let's say he makes a stir fry, and he says, "Yeah, this is Yoshon. This food is Yoshon," but he doesn't realize that soy sauce contains wheat in it. So he's being honest that he really thinks that the food is Yoshon, but he doesn't actually really know enough to say the truth of that statement that it actually is Yoshon. So before you, so to speak, trust the person, you have to just make sure that the person really has all the information that you need to take a position on that and actually say that food is Yoshon, even if he, again, the person who's not being particular himself at home for Yoshon may not know all the information in order to answer that question properly. Okay, so now let's move on from Yoshon to two questions about Chalav Yisroel. And the first one is similar to the other first question, and that is, okay, we don't eat only Chalav Yisroel in our family. We eat even Chalav Stam, and I see other people are eating Chalav Yisroel, and it seems to be that that's a better thing to do. Is that something worthwhile? Should I start do that? Is there reasons why I should be doing it? So to understand this, actually it's similar to the way we spoke about Yoshon a couple of minutes ago, and that is the Mishnah says that the Chacham told us that you can only drink milk if a Jew is standing there watching the cows be milked. It doesn't have to be a cow; it could be a sheep or other camel also, but you have to be watching it to make sure that the milk that comes out of there it's coming from the kosher animal, not from a non-kosher animal. So that's pretty straightforward. That you have to eat Chalav Yisroel. But when we poke around and probe a little deeper into the reason why the Chazal answered it, there may be two possible justifications for being mekel in certain circumstances. And the first is the reason why Chazal made this isser to eat chalav akum is, as I said, because they want to make sure there isn't non-kosher milk mixed in. Okay, no problem. So Pri Chodesh says that takana only makes sense in a situation where the person who's non-Jewish would have some incentive to put in non-kosher milk, and he has realistic possibility to do that. Okay, what happens if non-kosher milk costs more than the cow's milk? Or there are no non-kosher animals altogether that are fit for milking in this whole town. There's nothing here. So he says, the Pri Chodesh says, in that case, Chazal would have never required they eat only Chalav Yisroel because there's nothing to be concerned about. And therefore, he holds that in those kind of cases, a person could eat milk or milk products even if there was no Jewish person there by the milking. Chazon Ish accepts this opinion of the Pri Chodesh. So he says in certain countries, you could drink milk even if it's not Chalav Yisroel. He doesn't specifically say the United States, but that is a good example of that because there's no real easy way for a farmer to get non-kosher milk. The machines that you use for milking cows aren't even suited for other animals other than cows. And the truth is, if he got milk from let's say from a horse, it would be way more expensive than cow's milk. So he has no incentive at all to mix in the other milk. So Pri Chodesh / Chazon Ish would have said that you'd be allowed to eat it. Now, Moshe Feinstein gave a different reason to be mekel, and that is he says that the Pri Chodesh has one sheet. The Chasam Sofer argues on the Pri Chodesh, and he says that the Yid has to watch it even in a place where there's no incentive for the person to cheat. You still have to make it Chalav Yisroel. But he says, but when the Chacham said a Yid has to watch it, so most people think that says that's what you have to do. A Jew has to watch it. Moshe says no. That's if you look at in the rules of evidence, you can talk about a bezdin watching something happen. An eyewitness to an account is a very strong level of evidence. But there is an even stronger level of evidence, and that's called anan sahadi. Anan sahadi means we are the witnesses, which means there's something that's so obvious and so clear that it's as if everybody is testifying that it's true. So it's not just one eyewitness or two eyewitnesses who are coming and saying that something is true. It's obvious to everybody that this thing is true. So Moshe says, when Chazal said you have to have a Jewish person watching it, they weren't specifically saying you have the Jew watch it. They were saying bring him a level of proof that's as strong as a person watching. If we can have an Anan Sahadi, that's even better proof. Then Chazal would have for sure been happy with that thing. So he says in the United States, the government oversight on the dairy industry, together with the fact that the producer, the dairy farmer, is afraid will completely lose his business if he got caught cheating and putting other milk into it. All of that together creates an anan sahadi. Creates it's obvious to everybody that what's in that bottle, in that container, is cow's milk. No one has the slightest doubt. It's obvious to everybody that's cow's milk, and therefore it's even stronger than the proof of a Jewish person watching it. So these are two reasons why there are people who eat what we call chalav stam. We eat milk that's not produced as Chalav Yisroel, even though they follow all the dinim. They're in general they're following the Shomer Shabbos and they follow other mitzvahs of the Torah. They don't do what the Gemara says, so to speak, that you have to have Chalav Yisroel, because one of these two reasons why they hold that it's okay. That's true, but and the end of the day is these are very novel interpretations of the din. The din says you're supposed to watch it, and these are both saying, nah, it's okay, you don't have to watch it. There happen to be people who disagree with these opinions, but aside from disagreeing, these are very novel opinions. And for example, Ramosha himself says that, he says many times, he says if a person has a choice, they should eat the good old-fashioned traditional Chalav Yisroel rather than being makel and allowing this product, what we call Chalav Stam. He had a different name for it, but that's what we call it. So the most obvious reason why a person would want to eat only Chalav Yisroel is because they want to avoid relying on this kind of an unusual or novel interpretation, and instead would rather just go with a more straightforward requirement to have Chalav Yisroel. Now, there are some secondary advantages of Chalav Yisroel. Three that I can tell you are, one is there are certain surgeries that are done to animals, to cows, that could potentially make them into a treifa, meaning they would become not kosher. In a Chalav Yisroel production, Mashgiach makes sure that those cows are not used for milking. There are halachic reasons why that's not such an issue for non-Chalav Yisroel, but in the end of the day is, the person eating Chalav Yisroel is avoiding those animals, the milk from the animals that would be treifas. Second is, it's not so clear exactly which countries these leniencies apply to. I told you, Pri Chodesh, and Ramosha, who say it's mutter in certain countries. Not so clear which countries it works in. So in the United States, the milk coming from the actual United States is okay, but there are other countries which are not as obvious that it should be mutter, and some hashkachas will be makel about things that not everybody would agree to. So that means is a person who buys Chalav Yisroel knows that he's for sure getting stuff that's okay, that's Chalav Yisroel, as opposed to if he buys the non-Chalav Yisroel, he may be getting some dairy components that are coming from countries that not everyone agrees these leniencies should apply to. And the last is that the people who make Chalav Yisroel, by and large, tend to be more particular about how a certain other halachic issues aside from the Chalav Yisroel. Like, for example, what temperature do they kasher their equipment at, or how much oversight do they do when they make Gvinis Yisrael, special halachas for making cheese for Gvinis Yisrael? How do they do that? So they have other hakpadas, other things that they're careful about that you gain by eating Chalav Yisroel that might not be present if you ate non-Chalav Yisroel. Okay, now, that leads to the next question, and that is, okay, I know people who eat not Chalav Yisroel, who eat only Chalav Yisroel, but yet they eat donuts and Dunkin' Donuts. Well, those are not Chalav Yisroel. So why do they eat those? If they only eat Chalav Yisroel, why would they say, yeah, but we're allowed to eat the donuts at Dunkin' Donuts? So the answer to that is that Chazal were concerned that people would adulterate cow's milk with milk from non-kosher cows, correct? And that's why, as I've told you, that's why you can only eat Chalav Yisroel. Now that's the reason. That's why they asked eating Chalav Yisroel. Chalav Akum. Now separately, they made another isser that a person can't eat cheese made by someone who's non-Jewish unless it meets certain qualifications called Gvinis Yisrael, a Jew's cheese. Okay, so there's two different isurim. One is to eat Chalav Akum, and one is to eat Gvinis Akum. Okay, so those are two different isurim, and there's something that there's a group of items. They come from milk, but they're not milk, and they're not cheese. Okay, they're in between. Okay, and so they don't fall into the rules of Chalav Yisroel because they're not milk. They don't fall into the rules of Gvinis Yisrael because they're not cheese. Okay, we call those things butter, chema. We call those things butter. The actual what we're about to talk about may not actually apply to modern day butter, but that's not relevant to our discussion. It's just a class. There's milk products, there's cheese, and then there's butter. Milk has the rules of Chalav Yisroel, cheese has the rules of Gvinis Yisrael, and then there's this in-between thing called chema, which is butter. So in the Hartzvi says that powdered milk has the advantages of butter because it's not milk and it's not cheese, and therefore it's in this Goldilocks state. It's right there in the middle there, and it doesn't need It doesn't need to be Chalav Yisroel. It doesn't need to be Gvinas Yisroel. So you could buy it even if there was no Jewish person watching during the milking. He said this about powdered milk. Powdered milk means is milk they boil out all the water out of it to the point that it turns into a powder. And that powder has a lot of the properties of milk, but it's not like liquid form. So those people who follow this opinion will eat food if they know that they only eat Chalav Yisroel, but if it's powdered milk, if the dairy is from powdered milk, they'll eat it. And the donuts at Dunkin' Donuts, at least locally, are made from the dairy component is made from powdered milk. So they say, hey, I'm allowed to eat things. I only eat Chalav Yisroel, but I can eat powdered milk. That's not Chalav Yisroel, so therefore they would be lenient. Now, other poskim disagree with this hard tzvi for two reasons. One is that the one of the preconditions for something qualifying as butter, things only are considered butter rather than milk if it would be impossible to make that product from the milk of a non-kosher animal. Okay, and for what Chazal tell us, you can't make butter from the milk of a non-kosher animal. So that's in order to be butter. That one of the preconditions is that you couldn't make this out of non-kosher animals, and therefore we're confident that it only came from a kosher animal. Well, that's not true of powdered milk. You can make powdered milk out of milk from any kind of animal. So the Chazon Ish says that's a reason to disagree with this hard tzvi, because hard tzvi is trying to argue that the powdered milk has the status of butter. He says no, it doesn't even get into the ballpark to be considered butter. That's one argument, and the other argument from Mrs. Khan Aaron is that powdered milk does not have this leniency of butter for a different reason, and that's because you could reconstitute it right back into milk. Just add water and it turns right back into milk. So therefore, that's not the same as butter, which can't be reversed. You can't turn it back into milk. Okay, so most people who eat Chalav Yisroel are also do not agree with this hard tzvi and will not eat powdered milk products that are not Chalav Yisroel either. But there are those people who are makel, and who that's why some people who only eat Chalav Yisroel will still eat these donuts at Dunkin' Donuts. Okay, now our last question about Chumros is we just talked about Chalav Yisroel, and the question was, I got it, I heard of Chalav Yisroel, but what's Pas Yisroel? I don't know what that is at all, and am I supposed to be doing that? We just talked about Chalav Yisroel. What's this Pas Yisroel thing, and do I have to do that? So the Mishnah says that a person can't eat pas. I'm going to tell you in a minute what that word pas means. The literal translation is bread, but I can't eat pas unless a Jew participated in the baking of it, and that's called Pas Yisroel. Okay, the idea of it is to discourage fraternity between Jews and non-Jews, which could lead to intermarriage. Okay, so the Gemara says it was really difficult to do this because bread is such a staple food, and it's really hard to get. In those days, it was hard to get bread that was Pas Yisroel. So they took back this Isser. They retracted. Well, at some point, the Isser was retracted, and they said we're retracting it partially. If the pas was made by a baker, by a palter, then it's going to be mutter. Why would they allow it if it's made by a baker different than it's made by just a private person? The thinking is people really need to have pas, so that's the impetus for being lenient about something. And second is when you buy pas from a baker, that's a financial transaction. It's just a business deal. It's not social. It doesn't make me feel close to the person. It had nothing to. It's not like getting it from my next door neighbor, and it won't at all lead to intermarriage. And therefore, in order to help people who really needed bread, and it wasn't possible to get pas Yisroel, they said you could buy pas palter bread from these bakers who are doing it commercially. Now, some Rishonim say pas palter is only permitted when there's great needs, like the way in those days there was no way to get any bread. But what happens if you have Pas Yisroel available? Then you should eat, and that you should get that, and that the Isser still applies. And others say that once Pas Palter was taken back, once that part of the Isser was rescinded, then you could eat it no matter what, and even if it's available, you could eat Pas Palter. Also, the Ramah and most Yidden follow this latter opinion, and they say that you can eat, and you can even certify for that matter, things that are pas products that are made commercially, even if they're not Pas Yisroel. Okay, the Shach says no, you should be makbid and only eat pas palter unless when it's we should eat pas Yisrael when it's available, like the other shita. And some people even only eat pas will not eat pas palta even if there's nothing comparable in pas Yisrael. Okay, there's different opinions like that. Okay, those who follow the Ramah, even so, who the Ramah says you can eat pas palta even when the pas Yisrael is available on Shabbos and during a Shemei Tshuva will be more machmir. Now, which foods are pas? So the simple food is bread. Pas means bread. But also the rule is anything for which a person recites hamaitzi, if they eat it by itself or they eat it as part of a meal. Okay, well, how do I know what to make hamaitzi on? So a couple of requirements is it has to have one of the 5 grains in it: wheat, rice, spelt, oats, and barley. One of those 5 primary grains, and also have tzuras hapasa, shape, the form of a bread. So, for example, bread and matzah. So bread, pizza, cookies, cake, crackers, all those things are considered to have the shape of bread. And if a person eats enough of them, you'd make hamaitzi on them. They may not be actual bread, but they're close enough to bread. It's called possible kisnin, that you make hamaitzi if you ate enough of them, and therefore they're included. But things like pasta or like little cereal like Cheerios or oatmeal, those things do not have tzuras hapas. They don't have the shape, the form of a bread. They have nothing. They're so far removed from bread that you wouldn't make hamaitzi no matter how much you eat. Those do not need to be pas. There's a difference of opinion about whether wraps are considered pas or not. So you can ask your rabbi about that. So all the things that are included in pas, bread and matzah and crackers and pizza and cakes and cookies and all kinds of things like that are in the rules of pas. And for those people who are makbid on pas Yisrael, who are makbid on pas Yisrael when it's available, would want to eat those foods only if they are in pas Yisrael. Now we have time. I'll do. Let's see a little bit more. Some more questions. We have some time still. And the first question is: are all chickens kosher? What about all ducks and geese and turkeys and quails and things like that? Are they all kosher? There has been some tumults about it, and that's, I guess, why they asked the question. And so the answer is like this: the Torah gives us all kinds of ways. Very clear directions of how to know which animals and fish are kosher. Animals have to chew their cud and have split hooves. Fish are kosher if they have scales that can come off without ripping the flesh. So those are pretty clear. But for birds, the Torah does not give us criteria for knowing which birds are kosher, which ones are not. It just says these are 24 birds that are not kosher, and the rest are all okay. Now, the Torah the Gemara tells us some ways of identifying kosher and non-kosher fish, but there were different signs of how to figure it out. But those signs were not as obvious as chewing your cud or having scales or things like that. And mistakes happened, and people relied on what they thought were these signs to figure out which was a kosher bird, and in fact they made mistakes. So the minhag with time developed that we only eat birds that we have a masur, that we have a tradition that they're kosher, and if we don't have a masur, then we don't eat those birds. So there's masur for chicken, duck, geese, turkey, and quail, but not all breeds of them. And that is as follows. For chicken and turkey, all the common breeds that we see have a masur to them, and one exception is the chickens that lay green and blue eggs. Those we do not consider ourselves to have a masur for those. Ducks and geese, there are specific ones that we have a masur for. That includes the mallard and the Pekin ducks and the white Emden and gray-toed geese. But other ones are more questionable, including Muscovy duck and Moulard duck and Canadian geese. The Canadian geese are the ones, at least where we live, they roam through the parks. They have the long black necks. Those we do not have a masur for. Okay, and now when we turn to quail, there are lots of birds called quail. Basically, lots of small birds. People just call them quails. There's one that has a masur for it, Caturnix. And so that means if you go to the store and you want to buy a chicken egg, you can assume that the chicken egg is kosher. It came from a kosher chicken. From ducks, geese, and quail, we would not recommend you eat them unless they have a hashkacha to make sure that it came from a kosher breed and not from a non-kosher breed. One last bird to mention, not so much for eating, and that is Miss Robins. There isn't a clear masur that robins are kosher, but many people will perform the mitzvah of shluch al-kain on robins. That mitzvah only applies to kosher animals, kosher birds, but people assume that they're kosher, but they wouldn't make a bracha on that mitzvah shluch al-kain because on the question of maybe it really isn't kosher. So they would do the mitzvah on the assumption that probably is kosher, but not with a bracha and they would not recite a bracha on that. Okay, that's it for now. There's actually a whole group of more questions that the boys asked. Maybe we'll save that for a different time.